Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science and spirituality with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. Today, Mark Vernon joins me. His new book, A Secret History of Christianity. Here's some extended clips from the show. Who is Mark Vernon, and why do you feel nervous when you're called a Christian?
Yeah, it's because the word Christian means so many different things. It's also a big part of my own story. I used to be an Anglican priest, and I left, and I went through this kind of great searching phase, the agnostic phase. That's when I discovered Socrates, because one thing about Socrates is that he went around asking people questions.
But it's the kind of stuff that drives me nuts about the Christian worldview and how it gets overlaid on top of these important discussions. The pivotal moment of human evolution was 2 millennia ago. What? Hold on. Time out. Who says that? According to who? It's like that is indefensible from our scientific understanding of history.
I think there is a kind of story that can be told and can actually be made to stack up as well. It's not just a Christian triumphalist claim, but the individual with a kind of microcosm that then can begin to feel it mirrors the macrocosm, and so knows the macrocosm in a different way, a different kind of consciousness. Something crystallized around these centuries, which we call, the first century of AD, for example. Something does seem to have evolved around then and shaped not just the Western world, but the Eastern world as well.
Can we bring back some knowledge from people who claim to have entered these extended consciousness realms?
Yeah. I think that our task now is to relearn what mystics of old have told us about. And it's a sort of, in a way, it's a democratizing process, I think, because, a lot of mystics before, they were rather kind of elite monks and nuns. They went up into the Himalayan mountains for years on end, or they lived in enclosed orders in Europe. And what we're in now is a much more general kind of spiritual revolution, where all sorts of people are practicing these techniques, but also bringing other experience to it as well, whether it be thinking about NDEs, whether it be thinking about psychedelics. A whole range of spiritual experimentation is going on.
Here's my hunch at this point. There are these multiple extended consciousness realms, and they are the greater reality. And we will always be limited from our reality because it's a lesser reality.
Maybe just to throw in some thoughts from what I've got from Dante's Divine Comedy, because he goes through these, 3 realms, broadly speaking: hell, purgatory, and paradise. And in hell, there's lots of trickster stuff going on. There's actual sort of demons that he encounters, but even the souls that he encounters down there, he learns that actually they're telling him one thing, but they're fooling him in another way as well. And it's as he learns to discern that he's able then to move in the story to the next level, which is the purgatorial level, which is when, as it were, he works much more on his own, the purification, if you like, of his own capacities to see and to understand and to discern. And then when that is sort of good enough, he's able to move into paradise. But it doesn't stop in paradise either. Going up through the different spheres of paradise for Dante is a constant process of letting go what he thought had been the case before, seeing it was a pale reflection, just a kind of shadow or a working model of things, in order to rise closer and closer to the divine.
Today, I'm delighted to welcome Mark Vernon back to Skeptiko. He's got a new book coming out in a couple months, A Secret History of Christianity, and he was nice enough to send me a review copy. Now, the book, you can't go order it right now, but you can go pre-order it on Amazon, which is nice. But the great thing about Mark and the great thing about this book is, man, he just has a way of talking about these topics that are important to me in a way that I just enjoy having a conversation about. So he's written a bunch of other books. He's been on the show before, and I thought this was a great opportunity to have him back and talk about some of the topics that we're dealing with here on Skeptiko and get his take, in particular, his take relative to this research that he's done on a secret history of Christianity. I should also mention that Mark has a PhD in ancient philosophy, and I was just asking him who's that over his shoulder, and who did you tell me it is?
It is Socrates.
It is Socrates. So the Greek great thinkers will pop up again and again, probably in this dialogue and in the book. Mark is also the co-host of the Sheldrick Vernon Dialogues, which is just outstanding. We've talked about before on this show with, of course, featuring Rupert Sheldrake. He's also a professional psychotherapist, and along with working with individual clients there in London, he also serves his community with this great volunteer work in that area too. And that's certainly not only you're to be commended for, but I think it just rounds out the person that people will know you to be and find you to be in terms of truly this person who's engaged with the larger spiritual community and what that means. So, Mark, welcome back to Skeptiko. Thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, well, thanks, Alex. It's really nice to be back. I very much enjoy your show, so it's great to contribute.
Well, it is a contribution. You know, the last time you were on, I titled the show, Is Christianity Worth Saving? So that will just give people a sense for how you're willing to go there. And that's one of the things I really appreciate, is that we can have these kind of discussions, much needed discussions, even though they don't necessarily jive with where we're coming from. It's just great to get intelligent people to contribute to this dialogue that I'm trying to have. So awesome stuff. Let's see where to start. You know, where I thought we'd start is, I love this quote for you. And the larger question is, who is Mark Vernon? And then why do you feel nervous when you're called a Christian?
Yeah, it's because the word Christian means so many different things. And I'm not sure if I want to be labeled with the thing that I'm being labeled with when the word Christian pops up. But it's also a big part of my own story. You know, I used to be an Anglican priest in the Church of England, that is. And then I left and I went through this kind of great searching phase, the agnostic phase. That's when I discovered Socrates, you know, because one thing about Socrates is that he went around asking people questions. How do you know what friendship is? How do you know what courage is? And so on. The psychotherapy was really important too, because that was a big, intensive period of personal work. And I got that very much from Plato as well, actually, that who you are as a person and the work you're doing on yourself as an individual completely shapes what you can perceive and see of the world around you, as well as your own inner life. You know, knowledge and virtue and desire and will. In the ancient world, these things were all completely knitted together. And so I learned that very much from that process. And, you know, I've written this book now, A Secret History of Christianity. It's partly to try and put Christianity sort of to bed, as it were, for me once and for all. Who knows whether it'll have done it. But, you know, it's really Christianity, isn't it? I mean, you often talk about evangelical Christianity, and then there's more mystical Christianity. And there's, in this country, this very kind of established state kind of Christianity. There's Christianity of different parts of the world. So, what are you calling me when you're calling me a Christian? I guess I think.
Right. Well, that would make anyone nervous, especially these days. You know, I also think it's interesting when you touched on the psychotherapy, because in looking over your website, it just kind of clicked for me that it would be interesting to sit across from you, I think, and engage in that kind of open forum where stuff is coming up for me. Talk a little bit, if you will, about your philosophy, about what that process is like for the people who enter that space with you. Why does it work? You alluded to it, but why does it work, do you think?
Well, I guess it's because we're creatures, we're beings that operate at many levels at the same time. But I guess particularly when things go wrong in life, or at least not as well as they might do, we tend to get stuck at one particular level. Maybe it's the most immediate, the most literal, the most empirical kind of level. and people can lose touch with different levels of themselves. It might be the levels that come out of their own personal past, the developmental side. Make an obvious example would be some kind of trauma that feels too much to live with, and so gets blocked off. But the trouble with that is that you're blocking yourself off from a part of your life as well. So it causes problems. It makes life feel limited. But also the more transpersonal side too. I think that we're spiritual beings, whatever that might mean, in some way or other. So having better access to that too can also come in through psychotherapy. And psychotherapy does it, I think, I increasingly think of it as a sort of hypnosis, in the sense that the kind of way I work normally anyway is that someone comes at the same time each week to the same room, very little externally changes, and it just allows a kind of shift of consciousness, a dropping of consciousness. So that more immediate level becomes less important, and that in itself allows other levels to come to the surface over time.
I love that expanded view, and I think it's awesome, and it feeds into kind of one of the main points I obviously want to bring to the table right from the beginning is this whole idea of consciousness, because the topic has already touched us a couple of times, and it's addressed directly in your book. I mean, the subtitle of your book refers to the evolution of consciousness. So I wanted to take one step back from that and maybe just ask you, what is your understanding of consciousness, the nature of consciousness? This is obviously a very prescient topic to me on Skeptiko, also in the Sheldrake-Vernon dialogues that you guys do. Rupert Sheldrake has been one of the leaders within the scientific community to raise his hand and say, hey guys, I think our lack of understanding about consciousness may be getting in the way of what we're calling science. So what is your understanding of the nature of consciousness at this point?
I guess that in the book, and the way that I've used this phrase, the evolution of consciousness, it really means the perception that we have of what it is to be human. So it's our personal perception, our sense of our relationship to others, our perception of our relationship to nature, to the cosmos, to the divine, to the spiritual world. And that I'm drawing a lot on the ideas of a chap called Owen Barfield in the book, who was one of the Oxford Inklings. So he was a great friend with C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. And both Lewis and Tolkien said that Barfield had the best ideas about this subject. But Lewis and Tolkien, in their different ways, were very great writers. And so they were able to build it into their writing. And Barfield did write a lot as well, but he's a bit more of a gritty writer. And in some ways, I'm trying to open up his ideas in my book. But his idea was that our modern consciousness, in the sense of this modern sense of who we feel we are, how we perceive life, has a kind of history, and it's changed, it's evolved, particularly over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, and it's trying to understand something of that, and particularly the role that Christianity has played in that I found very illuminating, and I try to unpack that in the book.
Well, we are going to unpack it here, don't you worry, because I have some questions, issues with that, but I want to get there kind of from a little bit of a roundabout way. First off, I think it's important that maybe you and I were definitely in the same camp. I consider maybe when we're going to talk about Christianity, I'm maybe in the loyal opposition part of this thing, where I am so much in agreement and so appreciate the dialogue, the conversation that you're bringing, which is much needed. Yet I have reservations about some of the points. And I guess I'd start with this. Materialism is baloney, as my friend Dr. Bernardo Kastrup would say. And I think it's important to pull this out and just pound it, although I certainly do a lot of it, is that we are enmeshed in a culture, in a scientific culture that completely denies that consciousness even exists. I just had an interview with the very excellent philosopher, Dr. Philip Goff, who's there in the UK, and you may know him. but he's been kind of trying to lead the charge and, hey, materialism really isn't the way that it is. But when we started to have this conversation, he goes, neuroscience isn't really married to this idea of materialism. It isn't married to this, you are a biological robot in a meaningless universe. And I had to call him on it and say, what part of neuroscience are you reading? What part of science are you reading? And we actually pulled up the Wikipedia entry for neuroscience, and he had to admit, yeah, well, I guess that is still the official position. And it's not enough people are doing what my friend here, Bernardo Kastrup, is doing, is saying, this is so intellectually ridiculous that we can't even fully comprehend how the people who are supposed to be the leading science figures, the Neil deGrasse Tyson and stuff like that, when they're asked about consciousness, they say, and I have the quote, and I played it last time, I suspect that we'll find it doesn't exist. I mean, how absurd is this to say, my consciousness is connecting with your consciousness? That is inescapable. And yet we are enmeshed in this scientific culture that is telling us that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. So 2 parts to that question, I guess. How far do you feel like you need to distance yourself from that understanding of consciousness? And then secondly, why do you think that persists when, Rupert will tell you it's complete baloney. All these other people will tell you complete baloney. Why does it persist? 2-part question.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of with you and with Bernardo Kastrup as well. Consciousness is the nearest thing to us. If you get rid of the nearest thing to us, then the rest of the world drops away as well. It just seems bizarre and odd to me that move's even been made. But Barfield actually has a bit of an answer indirectly as to why we might find ourselves in this stage now. Because his sense of how consciousness in the sense of our perceptions, how that evolves, is it goes through cycles where we feel alienated from the world around us. He thought that a cycle of alienation began in the period, sometimes what's known as the Axial Age, from about 500 or so BC to around the time of the emergence of Christianity. That was a kind of one sort of alienation. But we've embarked on a new kind of alienation now, which arises from the scientific revolution, so-called, the Enlightenment, the Reformation even actually as well. I think these have all had a big impact. And whilst that alienation causes us to feel disconnected from the world to such an extent that now we can do things that even 100 years ago would have been almost impossible to imagine. Not just, I think, that some people can go around saying that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, maybe doesn't even exist. I think also the same about the divine, actually. That it's only pretty recently, really, that full-blown atheism in the nihilistic sense has been possible. Nietzsche famously flags it up with the death of God. But Barfield said there's a meaning to that as well, which is that it causes us to withdraw into ourselves and to go through the struggle of trying to develop our own interiority. And it's so a sort of upside of this in a way is that, for example, we nowadays value the individual perhaps more than any other time in history. Men and women, all sorts of varieties of individual people. We now absolutely take it as granted that there's this sort of sovereignty of the individual. And however we try and work that out, that won't really go. But it leaves us with this sense of detachment. And so the sort of the third bit, there's the withdrawal, there's the development of the interior life. But then the third piece, which Barfield felt we are beginning to embark on now, and maybe people like Kastrup and others are beginning to take us back in that direction, is a reconnection with the world around us, but with the added advantage of our own interiority, which means that we can discern it that much better. We can embark back into the world around us with free will, with conscience and responsibility. So it's a kind of spiral of alienation and reconnection that takes us upwards, and it's part of our evolution, part of our development. So it's got a downside, and it can even become a kind of reductio ad absurdum, like there's no consciousness at all. But overall, Barfield, and I think you can find signs in our culture now that maybe there's a kind of return, but a return with difference. And that difference is a kind of progress, a kind of development. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It doesn't. It doesn't, because, and I got to just kind of take off as if I had any kit gloves on, but it's the kind of stuff that drives me nuts about the Christian worldview and how it gets overlaid on top of these important discussions we're trying to have about what is the nature of consciousness, what is the nature of this extended transcendental consciousness that Christ consciousness is talking about, a chapter in your book, and we're going to get to in a minute. I mean, here's the quote. You mentioned Owen A. Barfield, who is the grandson, but you get the idea. The experience of being alive evolves. The pivotal moment of human evolution was 2 millennia ago. What? Hold on. Time out. Who says that? According to who? It's like that is indefensible from our scientific understanding of history. Like archaeology, anthropology, history books, we don't have any, we can't point to 2,000 years ago and say, oh, wait, historically we have all this evidence that lines up that everything changed. Yet this is a thing you'll hear over and over again from Christians, is that this was a pivotal point in history, and then they breeze by it like it's true. They breeze by it like it's somehow true historically, or they allude to the fact that it's somehow true spiritually. And I challenge that too. Okay, show me how the Buddha fits into that. Show me how all the other great spiritual truths that have come from great spiritual minds before and after. Tell me how that fits in with this idea that this was this pivotal moment, this moment we know almost nothing about historically, why that was so pivotal. And I guess my real frustration that you're hearing here is that it just slides off the tongue so easily for folks who have been indoctrinated into this Christian worldview and are talking primarily to other Christians who just nod their head and go along with it as if it's, okay to say that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, this needs unpacking, and I hear what you're saying. Broadly speaking, so the idea is that evolution is, as Darwinian evolution is, as it were, one part of the story. It's the materialist part of the story, if you like. Through natural selection, sexual selection, all the other mechanisms that are described increasingly by evolution science. But people like Barfield, and also he was very influenced by other thinkers like Rudolf Steiner. They've made the point that that's just a positivistic notion of evolution. It's the kind of materialist notion of evolution. And if we are conscious beings, which we are, if we're spiritual beings with capacities for extended consciousness, which we are, in a way, the next piece of the evolutionary story that's going to come in is going to have to build that in. So, for example, I myself don't buy the kind of emergentist stories of evolution, that we started from a big bang, which was, as it were, purely material, and that through various degrees of emergence, consciousness sort of finally pops up, and then self-consciousness as well, in ways that aren't fully understood. And then you get into the whole panpsychist sort of back reading that tries to explain how it was sort of nascent there all along. I know you don't like panpsychism as well, and I think we'd be on the same page with that. It's the sort of last gasp of materialism, if you like. Right. So what we're going to look for in the future is a story of human evolution and the evolution of the cosmos and the world that builds in all aspects of our being, the spiritual and the material, for want of simplifying it.
Why are we going to do it from a materialistic standpoint? Why are we going to jump back over to that failed proposition? That's what I think is the hard part, is I think to totally break clean from that, as Rupert gets pretty close to there, but sometimes he even slips back into that. So when Rupert Sheldrake does his experiments and finds that these morphic fields somehow exist, and these little birds that learn to take the caps off of milk bottles before World War II still know how to take the caps off of milk bottles 6 years later after 3 generations of of birds. I mean, this is epigenetics kind of thing, which is a misnomer because we would have no idea how genetics would pass along that kind of information. So we're drawn to, like Sheldrick's idea of these morphic fields, that somehow this reality, this consciousness is a small tip of the iceberg on this larger consciousness that transcends space and time. If we make the shift and say that appears to be, as near as we can tell, the reality, then why do we want to switch back and start talking about this very time-based linear version of consciousness when we know that's probably not as close to what's real as the Christ consciousness version of consciousness?
Yeah. Well, I guess that I'm with you, I think, but we can only sort of take steps, nudges forward, if you like, and try and build in, get it to integrate with what we do know. And I think that Rupert's idea of morphic resonance is an attempt to take a sort of next step forward to say that the material, empirical, sort of touchable realm is only one part of it. And he gets his idea of morphic fields partly from electromagnetic fields, which are fields that are around us. We can't see them, but you can sort of measure them with detectors. So then morphic resonance is just a sort of an analogical extension of that. So he's trying to feel his way back into, I think, a spiritual vision of things, which I think, was much more common until the modern period. Again, it's like we've had to, I don't know if we've had to, but we have done this withdrawal to a kind of purely material sense of things, which has brought various advantages, the obvious medical advantages or whatever. But nonetheless, it's not going to rest there. And so we've got to find our way back into this bigger picture again. I mean, incidentally, I think mental health is in the vanguard there as well, because the treatment of mental health, usually struggles. And psychiatry can do certain things, but it's not really very successful in terms of treating people's mental health. It can help people find a holding position, if you like, sometimes. And so I think that, where I work as a psychotherapist, part of my interest there is how it's taking us back into a bigger picture of what it is to be human. Can I just say something about this 2,000 years ago again, and just sort of say something about what that might be. Really trying to say, because I think it is when put starkly, like the pivotal moment of human evolution was 2 millennia ago. It's way too stark, way too triumphalist, if you like. But what it's pointing to, what Barfield was pointing to, and what other people like Rudolf Steiner were trying to point to, was that something happened about that time that gave birth to the sense of being an individual as we really know it. It had been emerging before. I think that this axial age, from around about 500 BC, when you track figures like the Buddha in India, like Lao Tzu and Confucius in China, the Hebrew prophets, figures like Socrates around the Mediterranean, what they were starting to do was to shift the sense of what it was to be human, to have a consciousness from the outside, and take it inside. So the Hebrew prophets start saying, God doesn't want your temple sacrifices, he wants the sacrifice of a broken heart. The Buddha starts saying, look, the old Vedic traditions of the horse sacrifice and so on, that's not working anymore.
But wait a minute,
we need,
Mark,
we need techniques like meditation.
You're combining, you're just kind of creating a timeline, like I mentioned in the email to you. It's, to me, outside, as a non-Christian, someone who's brought up Christian and but found it very difficult to really get out of that shadow. And I kept thinking I'm out of that shadow, and I found I wasn't. Now that I feel like I am, I just look at that and I go, Mark, if that was played back to you, you would have none of it. How would we connect Buddha, the 500-year gap between Buddha and Christ? There's a lot of history there. I mean, how would we? It's classic apologetics of the worst kind that we hear from Christians all the time, where they're cherry picking data and working backwards to do it. I just don't think you'd go outside of the Christian community and find a historian to say, I've looked at all our recorded history, and here's the moment in time I would put my finger on and say, this was the pivotal moment. No one would say that if they weren't coming at it from a Christian perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I take the point. I think you can put together a historical story. So, for example, in the book, I talk about the story that comes out of the Hebrew Bible and how there's an evolution of consciousness that you can track through the Bible, and you can do it relatively objectively. So, for example, what you can do is stack up the bits from the Bible and put them on a timeline. Because modern biblical scholarship has teased out that certain bits of the Bible are older than other bits. It's not that Genesis 1 is the oldest bit at all. So if you do that, what you can do, for example, is show how the language gradually moves from an interest in what's going on outside to an interest of what's going on inside. It becomes more and more introspective, the language. And that sort of fits in a timeline. You can do the same with ancient Greek philosophy, because we've got a continuous record, if you like, of ancient philosophy, and similarly, not just Socrates starts challenging people and getting them to think for themselves, but for example, the Stoics and the Epicureans, the next generation of philosophers, they developed what has been called spiritual exercises, and this is the cultivation of the self, which is quite a new thing. So you can, I think, track. In the book, I only do it in the Mediterranean basin, and I do completely accept the point that that's a Western point of view. But I think it can be done from the Indian subcontinent and the Chinese perspective as well. People have done this, are looking at it increasingly now, this notion of the axial age. And what it suggests is that it is a bit pejorative from the Western point of view to say that we feel that there was this sort of pivotal moment when things like free will, for example, it's not until the 1st century AD that philosophers start talking about free will. That just hadn't really existed before. And then also things like fate, they start to lose their currency on people. People feel less and less that they're being controlled by fatalistic forces from the outside, but there's a kind of inner freedom develops. And this, just because of the vicissitudes of history, Christianity becoming so powerful in the West, it all starts to be thought about in Christian terms. But I think we're at a stage now where we can just loosen the need to claim it for Christianity and start seeing how actually it worked out in other traditions as well. So, for example, just to throw one more thought in there, the Bhagavad Gita, which is a text from maybe the 3rd century BC, but commentaries on the Gita is as much important as the Gita itself. And commentaries, too, start to develop notions of non-duality, for example. And that, too, requires a kind of individual consciousness that can appreciate the one and the many, the particular and the universal, and exist in this sort of non-dual realm. So I think there is a kind of story that can be told and can actually be made to stack up as well. It's not just a Christian triumphalist claim, but the individual with a kind of microcosm that then can begin to feel it mirrors the macrocosm, and so knows the macrocosm in a different way, a different kind of consciousness. Something crystallized around these centuries, which we call, the 1st century of AD, for example. Something does seem to have evolved around then and shaped not just the Western world, but the Eastern world as well. What do you make of that?
Well, let me get there from another angle, because I think we're touching on some really important topics. They're important to me. This is the kind of stuff I love talking about, and I so, again, appreciate what you're bringing to it, because you have thought very deeply about this. And when we contrast that to what we get on a regular basis in terms of what people in the scientific or in the modern intellectual culture, which is mostly atheistic, especially over there, it's just complete gobbledygook. It just doesn't even have any possibility of being true. So I appreciate the dialogue. And I want to touch on this thing of Christ consciousness, because we've kind of talked about it a couple times. There's a chapter in your book titled Christ Consciousness. You have a lot to say about it. My issue is that I think this makes clear my point of Christ consciousness clearly transcends space-time. We can't talk about Christ consciousness and at the same time talk about history and then this happened this century and let's look at this text. It doesn't make any sense because everything we know about Christ consciousness tells us that it is as alive and meaningful today as it was yesterday, as it was for our grandparents and our great-grandparents. And we can extrapolate out of that, as all great spiritual traditions have done, and have say it is timeless. It is truly beyond space-time. So that's, to me, the misstep, is to start pointing to a point in history, then you're kind of misappropriating the idea of Christ consciousness, of something that is truly transcendent. So what do you think about, in general, about transcending consciousness? Because I think that's the issue. Is consciousness, our normal day-to-day consciousness, something that can be transcended? It's certainly something that spiritual masters throughout time have said is possible, both in the East and the West. And I brought up Jeffrey Martin because I recently had him on the show, and he's Harvard-trained social scientist who went out and interviewed extensively, like 8-hour interviews with mystical Christians, Buddhists, Sufis. I mean, he went to these communities. I love his methodology. He went to these communities and say, who is enlightened? Who is awakening? Who has transcended consciousness? Whatever you want to say, let me talk to them. And then he tried to understand what the phenomenology was of that experience. And again, to me, that's where we have to fit Christ consciousness back in and not try and mash it into some materialistic time frame. What do you think about
Yes. Well, yeah. So, I mean, maybe to speak personally, in a way, it was psychotherapy that gave me a sort of direct felt sense of how time changes at different levels of our consciousness. And at one everyday level, humdrum level, it is kind of clock time. It is calendar time. Although I increasingly sense that that's a sort of convenience. So that, we know when to speak to each other, we know when we're going to meet, we can put some sort of order at a mundane level into the world. But when you sit with people in psychotherapy, one of the key measures of what's going on is how fast time feels like it's going, or whether you feel you're more in a sort of getting into a more timeless zone. So, for example, if time feels like it gets a bit suspended, you know that you're sinking into less immediately conscious levels of someone's psyche. As it were, you're getting into something that they're not normally aware of, but is now coming to the surface. And conversely, if you sort of feel in a session you're kind of watching the clock and you thought half an hour had gone and only 5 minutes had gone, you know that you're at a very sort of humdrum level and you've got to try and work out how you can sink more deeply. And I think in psychotherapy, you even at times can get a sense of a kind of eternal level of the personal psyche, by which I mean a timeless level. And I personally had this when, in my own psychotherapy, which was pretty intense for a period of time, I gradually gained a sense of how things that had happened in my very early life had quite as much an impact upon me now as they had back then. So in my personal psyche, I got a sense of how there's a kind of timelessness, as it were. A lot of important events are kind of coexisting, you might say. And that really was so valuable to me because it gave me a direct sense of how, by analogy, I could imagine that in the world around us, in the cosmos around us, whilst there is kind of seasonal time, solar time, if you like, with the Earth going around the sun, there is something that's sort of unfolding in that normal way of using the word time. I think there's also a kind of timelessness, eternity, which is co-present with that too, which I guess the mystics are onto. And, in the West, we might call it Christ consciousness. In the East, we might call it Buddha consciousness. But nonetheless, it's possible through all sorts of techniques, maybe not psychotherapy, maybe meditation and so on, to get more in touch with that more timeless zone, that more eternal zone. So I see these things happening sort of at the same, they're just different levels of consciousness, and it depends what level of consciousness we're operating on at that particular moment. And the mystics get good at aligning themselves to the more timeless zones, whereas many of us get more stuck at these time zones, if you like.
I think you're bringing something really interesting to the table with psychotherapy, and you're kind of saying a couple of things I wanted to bring out and highlight. One is that you're suggesting that psychotherapy is somehow at the edge of this understanding of the transcendence of consciousness in a scientific way. So, of all the sciences, psychotherapy has always been the stepchild that's left outside, and that's maybe freed it up a little bit to say, well, there is something to your scientific method, but let's explore this and that with it, and I think that's really cool what you're doing there. And I think the other thing that is just really, I think will resonate with people, anyone who's been in therapy, is kind of, I love how you talk about it as being a form of hypnosis in a way, or akin to hypnosis, and in that way being this catalyst to transcending space and time to this extended consciousness. So I wanted to highlight those points. I don't know if you have anything more to say about that, but I'd be interested in hearing if you do.
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, I think that the reason why psychotherapy sort of emerged was because in the West, particularly the Reformation, we lost our wisdom about inner life, and we lost our wisdom about the mystical side of things. And certainly Carl Jung said this. He said that this left a kind of void that needed to be filled. And so he wasn't at all surprised that before Freud, because there were people working on this stuff before Freud, Freud became this sort of central figure for good reasons and bad. I think mostly because he was a great writer, and so he gave phrases that hooked into people's minds. But certainly, for my own practice, he's not a very important figure actually. People like Jung and then other British psychotherapists are equally important. But nonetheless, it's an attempt to recover a kind of inner wisdom that is partly clinical. It's partly about trying to help people who are suffering, but it's got this great spiritual potential as well. And one of the things which I really hope is that psychotherapy can develop ways of talking with other disciplines and with spiritual traditions, which I think it is. I think Buddhism, has gone an awful long way to do this now. There's a number of great writers who are both Buddhist and psychotherapists. People think of people like Mark Epstein and others like that. The way that Buddhism's come into the West, it's very much focused on this inner mystical side, with the inner practices like meditation. I think because Christianity more or less forgot about this. And so Buddhism has found there's a bit of an opportunity to reintroduce these practices that open this side of life up again. And I hope psychotherapy can increasingly be part of that discussion.
Great. I agree. I hope so too. I hope in particular the kind of psychotherapy, I mean, if psychotherapy is more of an art than a science, or a combination of an art and a science, I think it's people like you who will usher that change in a way, and other people too. But I mean, I think the work that you do there is just interesting because it's what you're bringing to it rather than some technique. We know it's not some technique, although techniques can be helpful too, but
mm-hmm. I quite like, I know that Jack Hunter, the anthropologist, and I really like the way that he's talking about anthropology as almost building a set of models or cases, telling stories, and the way I think psychotherapy works best is when it has a kind of ensemble of kind of stories, cases, maps almost, and that what you do is you bring in the map that's going to help you just take the next step. And then that works for a bit, and then it loses its efficacy. So you bring in a kind of another map and see whether you can take another step. Because what you're always trying to be in touch with is reality itself. But we need these kind of things that mediate us along the way a bit. And so I think that maybe psychotherapy is a bit like anthropology. It kind of stands on the edge of a scientific approach, but it's also, there's a lot of art and a lot of insight and discernment that's required to be a really good psychotherapist, and I think a really good anthropologist. Increasingly that's been seen.
Love it. Love the parallel there. Have never thought about that, but I will forever. Forward. Nice. So let me then trace where we've been, because I think it'll help introduce this next point. Where I was really trying to start with you is this idea that I think we're in sync on, that there is something called consciousness. And the only reason to even mention that is to, again, observe that we are enmeshed in a culture that completely denies consciousness. And we want to forget that we are, because it's so absurd that we don't really even know where to go with that. But, you know, our kids, our friends, our next generation are all being indoctrinated with this idea that you don't really exist when we get down to it. And we'll put a lot of nice flowery language around that, but you don't really exist. You don't really have feelings of love. You just have this biological firing that's going on in your brain. There really isn't anything there. And so I've beaten that horse to death maybe, but that's an important point one. And then I think where we went next, where I was trying to take you, is there is a way to transcend that ordinary. So consciousness is real. Consciousness is something that we don't understand the nature of it exactly, but it is there. That voice inside our head is real. It's real for all of us. And then I think where I was trying to go with the Christ consciousness, and with the reference to the very excellent Dr. Jeffrey Martin, is if we go study people who say, spiritual people, spiritual masters, who say this thing consistently, you can transcend that ordinary consciousness. You can get beyond it in this world, if you will. Now, maybe it takes us to another reality or to an extended consciousness, but there is a there is some place to go. And if we talk to mystical Christians, and then if we go back and look at history and we talk to Rudolf Steiner, or read Rudolf Steiner because we can't talk to him, or we talk to the great gurus and mystics from all these traditions, they're all saying that. So I think that's an important reality, and that's why I threw on the table this idea of Christ consciousness, because when people are talking about Christ consciousness, that's what I think they're talking about, is a transcendental consciousness. When you are communicating with Christ in that space, you have transcended space and time. There's no two ways about it. So, a long-winded way of saying, what can we learn? Can we start making some claims, some assumptions? Can we bring back some knowledge from people who claim to have entered these extended consciousness realms, like I was just talking about, or like I like to talk about frequently on show, the NDE, extended consciousness experience. And again, that's important because with the scientific overlay, if you have to acknowledge, we can kind of tell them to shut up now because these people are dead. You have no way of explaining how they would have any conscious experience. So please don't interrupt me when I tell you that there is this extended consciousness realm, and here it's showing up, and now you have to start explaining it. But that isn't the conversation for you and I. The conversation for you and I is, you said you tuned into the episode with David Sunfellow, who is compiled so many of the great near-death experience science researchers and has tried to say, hey, there is a message coming through from this extended realm, and it's a very spiritual message, and this is what it says. And with regard to your book, I think it challenges that in a way, and it says, you know, don't worry about a secret history of Christianity. Worry about the current message that Christ consciousness is bringing through in the form of these NDE experiences. That was very long-winded, but maybe you can start unpacking that for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that our task now is to relearn what mystics of old have told us about, and it's a sort of, in a way, it's a democratizing process, I think, because a lot of mystics before, they were rather kind of elite monks and nuns. They went up into the Himalayan mountains for years on end, or they lived in enclosed orders in Europe. And what we're in now is a much more general kind of spiritual revolution, where all sorts of people are practicing these techniques, but also bringing other experience to it as well, whether it be thinking about NDEs, whether it be thinking about psychedelics. A whole range of spiritual experimentation is going on. And I think that the key thing is to try and discern our way through it. A person I really like in this area is Jeff Kripal, the psychologist of religion. And one of the big points which he's making is how a lot of the experiences that people have, whether it be NDEs, whether it be UFOs, these extended consciousness experiences, they're always reflexive, as it were, this sense of things which ultimately is beyond us. In order to take it in some way, we need to take it in a way that we can relate to, that inevitably maybe sort of paints it in rather too concrete colors, or maybe reduces it somewhat. Although there's also always a sense that it's channeling something bigger than just the immediate report, if you like. So, so NDEs, the common trope in NDEs about light and gardens and beauty and so on. Now, these are kind of earthly images, if you like, squared, that are trying to say, it's something a bit like this, but a whole lot more besides. And I think that trying to discern this whole range of paranormal experiences, it's very much where we're at now. It's very much what our task is these days, trying to link it with what people said before in the mystical traditions, but to remake it again now. So that's how I kind of understand where we're at now. It is an evolution. It is like a next step. It's not just a recovery. And sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes it's just weird. Sometimes it's frightening. As I know you talked about before. But it's also exciting. This is, I think, the spiritual leading edge of our times, recovering and moving on from this biological robot. There's no such thing as consciousness. And there's a reason, I think, why these NDEs, why these UFO experiences, why the paranormal psi, it doesn't go away. But it's because it's this extended consciousness pressing back in on us and saying, you've got to make something of this for your own humanity, let alone anything else.
That's certainly one way of looking at it. And I have a ton of respect for Jeff. I just love the work that he's done, and he's somebody who's really advanced the ball a lot. But I really take issue with the basic premise of it. Inevitably, he seems to be sidestepping a lot of the data. If we want to be social scientists, if we want to appreciate what you're saying, like with Jack Hunter, which I appreciate, he's saying, let's take the tools that we have and let's apply them the best we can. Similarly, with the beautiful thing you said about psychotherapy, which I think is spot on. Let's take these collection of techniques, accounts, stories, and let's use our best methods to figure out what they're telling us. So when I hear people creep up to the edge of the border of the near-death experience science data and then say, oh, but now let me jump over all of that because clearly they have a cultural overlay and they were a Christian before and that's why they saw Jesus and put him in sin. We don't know that. We can't say that. I think we have to settle in to the social science tools that we have and look at like the work of Jeffrey Long, who's a medical doctor, oncologist, works with dying all the time, has put together a scientific survey of 3,000 now near-death experiencers and start sorting through those accounts and understanding and correlating and sifting through the data in the same way that I referenced, Dr. Jeffrey Martin and the transcendent experience. I love the fact that a Harvard-trained social scientist is saying, let's see what we can tease out of there. And I'm not comfortable with Jeff Kripal saying, well, it's all just kind of paranormal, isn't it? And isn't it funny how elves and this, hey, maybe, but again, show me the data. Or acknowledge that we're not going to play that game. If we're not going to play that game, okay. But then you and I don't need to be having this conversation. You don't need to be writing books. No one else needs to be doing anything if we're not going to try and engage with it. So do you think there is this lack of engagement with the near-death experience data, science?
Well, I mean, you would know better than that because it's something which I've sort of touched in on, not at least through your programs. But I think what the struggle is to try and develop a language that that absorbs from the past, that absorbs these cultural overlays, but does transcend them. Maybe a little example might be useful. I just read actually Jeff Kripal's latest book, which is co-authored with Elizabeth. I've forgotten her surname. Elizabeth Knock, is it?
A Flash or something like that.
Yeah, yes, yes, right.
It's about a woman who has this extraordinary near-death experience outside of her synagogue in Houston, which happens to be blocks from where Jeffrey Kripal lives. And as chance would have it, they wind up writing this book together because she has this really dramatic near-death experience with all the usual stuff of meeting God and encountering it. So
yeah, Elizabeth Crone is her name. Yeah.
Oh, great. Changed in a Flash, is it, I think?
That's it. Yeah. So I read this book, and one of the things that struck me was how Elizabeth Crone's experience of paradise, her NDE sort of takes her to this beautiful garden where she's there for 2 weeks and she learns various things. And a number of the things which she learns, for me, have parallels with what Dante describes in Paradise in the Divine Comedy. I'm a huge fan of Dante's The Divine Comedy. I think it can be read as a kind of early attempt to describe in kind of early modern ways the kind of things which we're trying to talk about now. So, for example, the way that she describes telepathy in Paradise is really interesting because it's not actually just I can read your thoughts and you can read my thoughts. What it is that all minds have access to a kind of big mind. She doesn't call it God, but maybe that's a word that will come to some people's minds. But there's a kind of universal intelligence that she senses, and so it's triangulated through this universal intelligence, which she has access to in Paradise. And Dante says exactly the same thing. Dante says that he realized in Paradise that his thoughts were known by the angels and the souls and Beatrice and so on, the people he encountered, because they were all sharing in this kind of extended consciousness in Paradise. It was triangulated. Now, it's just one example, but it was really interesting to me that that's how it's structured. And I thought maybe that's a true thing that's beginning to come through about how these telepathic communications, this extended consciousness works. That it's not a bit like me and you speaking together. It's because we both have access to a wider mind that shows us things or in which we see things. Maybe it's details like that which are going to take us the next steps forward by looking at the accounts and making comparisons.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. The one pick I would be picky, though, with the word beginning. Beginning, let's go back to Plato, right? And he's talking about the near-death experience of a soldier, right? So it's back to the very beginning. And the you are a biological robot in a meaningless universe meme, as you correctly pointed out, is a very modern, once in history. We can't point to any other part of in history or any other culture that's adopted such a ridiculous idea, which may raise a more interesting question of why. Why is that being advanced? Is there a reason for that? Is there an attempt to make us forget or not remember these truths that I think we know, and throughout time, every mystic has told us, oh yeah, I found it. I know the truth now. And if we're to understand the near-death experience, one thing we can take away from that is not a recent phenomenon. That is not a recent phenomenon. That just didn't start today. We can be pretty confident that throughout time, people have had these kind of experiences. And that might be a far better explanation for what we're reading in the Christian texts and why they have these parallels with these other great spiritual traditions. I mean, back to the question, are we missing the boat when we don't start with, for example, the extended consciousness as described from the near-death experience science? Isn't that the starting point?
Well, Plato's NDE, or the myth of the soldier at the end of the Republic, that he spends a long time describing it, actually. It's really quite remarkable when you read it. It's not just, I heard of an NDE experience. He describes it in great detail. And but what seems to be coming through there is that the NDE experience that Plato describes and uses has a particular meaning for that time. And in particular, I think the meaning for that time is that the soldier that has the NDE, he experiences a process of judgment, and he learns that what's really important is to cultivate your own soul and to choose what's good in life and to refuse what's bad, what's evil, so that you can as well make yourself ready for the next life. Now, that at Plato's time was quite a new idea. It's moving on for these ideas of fate. So if you read Homer, Achilles doesn't worry about the goodness of his soul. Achilles worries about being a hero. And that, as it were, was the thing that would make him a god, that would give him immortality back in Homer's time. So I think Plato is on the emergence of a new consciousness, which is saying, no, the individual can cultivate their soul so that they can, as it were, tune into what's good in the cosmos and tune out of what's bad. And that this will have an impact upon their future incarnations in Plato's case. So
Mark,
the NDE just to summarize, the NDE has meaning for Plato, and he draws that meaning out. Now, we now take it for granted that there's good and ill and that we can live an ethical life and so on. As it were, the meaning of that NDE has passed through Plato into our general sense of things. But I think that the NDEs now are encouraging us to grapple with something new that, say, in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, who knows when, will become part of everyday consciousness then. So the NDEs are pushing us forward, I think, to become more and more aware of different parts of what it is to be human and how to live well.
Great. I guess I'm going to pick again at Plato didn't do that. Plato just recorded a near-death experience. Plato is David Sunfellow saying, hey, I just heard this great near-death experience account. Here's what I think it means regarding the purpose of life. So back to the idea that Plato is somehow evolving our consciousness, what seems to be, I don't like that term, evolution of consciousness.
Well, let me just frame it better to make it less concrete, because I think you're right. You picked up something right. I think what Plato was very in tune to the consciousness that was emerging at his time, and he creates
I think that consciousness has. There's a timeless nature to it. Those stories have always been there, and our overlay of some kind of evolution, I just not sure that is rock solid, in my opinion. It seems like we're better off going and studying that NDE consciousness, and then we can sort and sift through it and decide what we keep and what we don't keep. Whether hell, you mentioned the David Sunfellow interview. I thought it was very interesting about hell, and that really riles a lot of people, and particularly people in the Christian community and the progressive Christian community want to get as far away from hell as they can, and yet go read the near-death experience accounts, and there's a significant number of them that bring hell center stage. I think that's okay. We have to understand that. They bring judgment center stage. We have to understand what that means. And the message, I think, is very anti-Christian. It's fundamentally opposed to the Christianity that we understand, and that is there is no judgment. There is complete judgment. You are completely responsible for 100% of everything that you do, but only you, your soul, your consciousness will judge. There will be no judgment from any other entity, source, or higher being. It only comes through you, and your experience with hell will be, again, your soul, your journey for whatever purpose we can infer out of that. These are fundamental questions about what is the nature of this extended consciousness realm and how it relates to our life. And it just seems so much more accessible, available, and meaningful with this kind of data than it does from reading these old books.
Well, see, hell has a history too. Hell didn't really exist in Homer's time, for example. You know, when Achilles goes to the underworld and tries to meet up with his friend Hephaestus, Hephaestus is already fading away. He's already becoming a shade, and this is a terrible tragedy for Achilles. And so he's just going into this sort of, he's returning to the ancestors, was the traditional way of talking about it. Hell starts to emerge in the century or two before the birth of Christianity. And I think it starts to emerge in conjunction with the birth of a sense of being an individual, with having a kind of inner life, with having a sense of responsibility, because that brings in a notion of judgment. I think at first it is conceived as judgment from divine beings and so on. That's certainly what you get in the Christian text, you get in Plato as well. But I think what's happening now is that as we become more and more aware, as we evolve and realize that our I am, you might say, is an echo of the divine I am, to use the Jewish expression, that there's a divine spark within us, that we realize that we can take responsibility for our own judgment. And so now people have this sense very powerfully that, as it were, they're going to stand before a mirror and see themselves, and then make future choices and so on based on that stage of development, you might say. I mean, I really do see stages of development all the way through it when you really start to look at how things do have a history. The reason for that history, to kind of come to the second point, if I can just carry on for a minute, which I think you're also asking there, is that I broadly brought by a kind of Neoplatonic vision, which comes from about the 5th century AD, started to emerge about that time, which is that there's been a kind of, originally, as it were, there wasn't a big bang. There was what the Neoplatonists called the One, which was a kind of fullness of everything, and it was completely united, but was also completely excessive and couldn't but help sort of overspill itself. And it overspilled itself in ripples, as it were, that became the universe as we know it. But the trouble with that was that the further that these ripples moved away from the One, the more they lost touch with the One as well. And so things like evil and so on start to appear, a sense of alienation, a sense of fallenness, if you like, start to appear. And that the great story is of the One reaching out back in and gathering us, as it were, all to return, but with this amazing diversity that's going to return as well. So it's not just, as it were, a return to the old state. It's this spiral up, so that we will know what the particular and the universal is mirrored together. We'll know this non-dual consciousness, you might say. So there's a tremendous gain, as well as all the struggle and suffering that goes on the way. That's my best sense of a kind of the really big story, the really big spiritual story, that tries to understand why there's all this mess on the way, why there's all this struggle, why there's all these debates. What's that all about?
Awesome. Ed, you've been extremely open, as I knew you would be. We're jumping way off, but not really, from this new book that people are going to want to check out. And again, you can pre-order right now on Amazon, A Secret History of Christianity. And we're getting into, I think, some of the thinking that went into and evolved on your part before writing this book. So I'm going to really stretch you on this last one, because I think it relates to your cosmology that you were just laying out there. And it's really a hot button issue for me, and that is ET consciousness. And you already alluded to Jeff Kripal, who's open to the idea of UFOs. And to me, it's like, oh boy, it's another one of those materialism is baloney things. It's like ET is just a reality. So many people haven't even understood that this is now disclosed, right? December 2017, New York Times, Defense Department comes out and says, yes, it's real. We have it. Here are the most senior officials in the military, and they'll tell you all these accounts. Here are our videos of ET. I interviewed Kevin Day, who was one of the people in that video, responsible for that video, that had, I shouldn't say responsible for the video. He was on board one of the ships, and he was like the Top Gun controller of all the radar and other information that led the pilots to go encounter the ET or the UFO. And he had a direct experience by going up on deck and seeing it. all this is a backdrop to saying, to kind of justify that I would even put up on the screen ET consciousness. No, the absurdity is that we can't talk about this. We still can't bring this on the table and say, no, we have to fully embrace this. We have to fully understand it. You know, I just talked to Ray Hernandez, who has to be credited with saying, okay, this is a reality. Let's go out and do some social science work, do a professional scientific survey, which he did with Dr. Leo Sprinkle, I think his name is. All these senior PhDs from Harvard and from other places, again, did a professional survey of what these experiences are. And so I want to bring that on the table without a chuckle, without a grin, and just say, we have to understand what this means in terms of this extended consciousness as it relates to these other non-human intelligences that seem to have a lot to do or a lot to say about this extended realm. They're doing a screening of our memories. They're doing telepathy in the way that you so beautifully talked about in Elizabeth's near-death experience. They seem in some strange way, like you're alluding to Kripal, that Kripal is kind of reaching for, and others, Jacques Vallée and others are reaching for, is like, wow, these extended realms seem to be somehow related. I think that's a misstep. I don't think we're ready to say they're related. I think the main message is that our reality, what we're calling reality over here, is, for lack of a better term, a lesser reality. And we're viewing everything in a hamstrung way because we're looking at it from the lesser reality. So let's talk about ET consciousness, and I know you've thought about it a little. What are your thoughts? How is this relevant, and how should it be relevant for someone who's trying to kind of understand things from this deeper spiritual perspective?
Well, the thought that comes to mind was a film, Arrival. I don't know if you saw the film Arrival, but I thought it was just amazingly prophetic film because for me it captured something of what it might be like to encounter an intelligent consciousness from another place that's, as it were, far superior to our own, and what that might be like. So in the film, the ET sort of globes appear. They're not globes, they're oblong shapes, almond shapes in the sky, and the military kind of put up cordons around them, and the world goes into meltdown. And the story focuses on this one scientist who's trying to learn to speak to the ET. And what she learns is that they're trying to show her something. And in particular, they're trying to show her something about the nature of time. And that as she learns their language, her consciousness itself shifts. And she realizes that she was already caught up in a set of experiences that seemed like precognitive dreams or flashbacks, flash forwards. She wasn't sure. But gradually she puts it together through her encounters with the ET. And her own consciousness massively expands because of the encounters with the ET. And I thought it was beautifully prophetic, because I think if we do less covertly have encounters with extraterrestrials at some point, it's very likely that it's going to be something like that. That the way we talk about time, the way we talk about beauty, the way we talk about mathematics, all these ways that we try and formalize our own intelligence, our own sense of engagement with the world, our own consciousness, it's going to be massively challenged, but I guess massively expanded as well. Because to get here, those ETs are going to have be far further down the line, you might say, than we are. So it's going to be probably terrifying and deeply unsettling, as these things always are. But with luck, maybe even films like Arrival will prepare us for that much, much more.
Well, what if we're already there? I mean, that to me is the overwhelming evidence. We're already there. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people have had encounter experiences. They haven't been allowed to talk about it because there is this incredible truth embargo. I hate that term, but it kind of fits. On talking about these accounts. I was referencing a minute ago the book by Ray Hernandez again. So you go out and you just start collecting data, and people start telling you, yes, this encounter, that encounter, generational, across multiple witnesses. And I love what you're saying in a sense, but I'm hoping you can connect this with the book, one, and the Christian experience, the Christ consciousness experience. Why isn't that showing up in the Christ consciousness experience, or how is it showing up? And I think I'd also like to connect it with this idea of evolution, because ET is fundamentally challenging our understanding of the evolutionary timeline and their role in that timeline in the past and their role in that timeline in the future. And again, this isn't a what if it happens kind of thing. That what the data is telling us is it has already happened, and we're just not willing to look.
So I guess my understanding of that would be that what has already happened is caught up with this struggle that people have to make sense of what's happened. And that's not just about, as it were, pinning down the facts, because I think that to encounter an extraterrestrial is also to encounter a kind of consciousness that's not immediate and everyday. The data seems to suggest that as well. So it's this very early stage which can sound sometimes a bit like madness, can sometimes sound a bit like a transcendent experience. That's what it's like when our own consciousness is challenged. So there's a lot of that going on. But as it develops, and maybe as it becomes more overt and less covert, and people are able to talk about it, and the researchers are able to unpack it at that stage more, it'll be very interesting for me, and maybe it'll be a challenge for me as well, to see whether, for example, I don't think that ET is going to talk about Christ, with a capital C, as it were, but maybe they will talk about things that are like the Logos, which is this the more mystical principle that's behind the Christ that Christians relate to. And the Logos is this underlying principle, this tendency to order, to rhythm, to pattern, to direction. On the one hand, it creates a sense that there's some sort of rationality in the cosmos. In another way, it's much more like a pulse of life and a draw, a tendency, an attraction towards that which is beautiful and good. So, if the ET encounters develop, and it turns out that our consciousness can match in some way that sense that they have too, that the universe does have a meaning, to put it no more generally than that, then that's going to be fascinating, because that will be something which our ancestors and ourselves have detected and have tried to articulate. And if that matches up with what they're telling us as well, then that will be, a tremendous confirmation, let alone the next steps in the evolution of consciousness.
See, here's what the data is telling me. Here's my hunch at this point, and I can't totally back this up. There are these multiple extended consciousness realms, and they are the greater reality. And we will always be limited from our reality because it's a lesser reality, just like people who go and have the information downloads in these extended realms and then return and say, when I was on board the ship, I knew everything. Now I don't. People have a near-death experience and they say, I talked to God before a question can even be asked. It was in my knowledge, I knew it, but when I came back, it was gone. So again, a lesser reality down here. What troubles me and what I work on is the idea that the ET consciousness is somehow fundamentally different than the realms of consciousness described as Christ consciousness and described as the NDE consciousness, and that there may be this purer form of truly a godlike consciousness, if you will. And there may be people who are playing in the gray zone, just like they do on this world, and are into deception, trickster, or just evolving towards something, and something greater or something lesser, and that we may be mistaking those. And again, my gripe or my complaint with Jeff Kripal is when we get so excited by the extended consciousness realms that we say, oh my gosh, isn't it exciting how the paranormal is paranormal, it all fits together. Maybe not. Maybe there is an aspect of this that stands apart. And I don't know if you've thought about that or if you have any ideas along the lines of deception, and is Christ consciousness, does it stand apart from these other extended consciousness realms, including shamanic realms or whatever you want to include in there.
Well, I mean, it's a big question again, but maybe just to throw in some thoughts from what I've got from Dante's Divine Comedy, because he goes through these, three realms, broadly speaking: hell, purgatory, and paradise. And in hell, there's lots of trickster stuff going on. There's actual sort of demons that he encounters, but even the souls that he encounters down there, he learns that actually they're telling him one thing, but they're fooling him in another way as well. And it's as he learns to discern that he's able then to move in the story to the next level, which is the purgatorial level, which is when, as it were, he works much more on his own, the purification, if you like, of his own capacities to see and to understand and to discern. And then when that is sort of good enough, he's able to move into paradise. But it doesn't stop in paradise either. Going up through the different spheres of paradise for Dante is a constant process of letting go what he thought had been the case before, seeing it was a pale reflection, just a kind of shadow or a working model of things, in order to rise closer and closer to the divine. And I don't know how long that model will last, but it seems to me to be a pretty good model, actually, that we should be aware of the tricksters. We should be aware of those who are in the grey zone. It's about discerning. It's about cultivating ourselves through virtues and so on, in order that we can see, facing our fears, facing our struggles, in order that we can move up these different realms. But even when we're in the sort of transcendent realm, I think that process continues still. It will be a constant process of letting go and being open to what's new. But step by step, you've got to sort of be able to rise too. It's not just, I don't think, sort of magic. Well, maybe if it is magic, suddenly you're at the point, that's when you're not going to be able to take it in at all. That's the optimum moment where when you come back down here again, you think, what was that? I can't begin to talk about it at all. That's the moment of forgetting. The download just empties out.
That was awesome. I really like that. So, Mark, I really appreciate all that. I think that's very, very interesting to me, and I think you're right on so many points. But I'll just leave it sit there without recapping. Again, tell us what else is going on with A Secret History of Christianity. Again, out in August, is that right? For us here in the U.S., we'll be able to buy it. And what else is going on with your other projects? You do tremendous work in terms of speaking engagements all around the UK. What else is on your plate and what people might find interesting about what you're doing?
Yeah, thanks. Well, the book's out at the end of August, and there's quite a lot of stuff on my own website, markvernon.com. I've made some little short films as well there, just to try and get the basic ideas of Owen Barfield across, which are these evolutionary ideas, a bit on Rudolf Steiner as well. I continue to do the discussions with Rupert Sheldrake. We've got more of those coming up. Very much in the same domain as you, I think, trying to develop the conversation, because I think it's only when we have these wrestlings with words, when we try and look at the data, when we try and look at what older texts can tell us, can illuminate, and also reflect on our own experience. This is very much at the cutting edge of where this is all at. This spiritual development, this trying to understand extended consciousness and not be trapped, as you put it so well, in the biological robot model. So, I really appreciate that all you do and the conversations that you spark as well, because I think it's all part of this whole effort to try and to expand things, to grow our imaginations, and to be able to perceive and see more.
Well, terrific. It's certainly been an incredible joy for me to have these kind of conversations, because they're few and far between, and I just love to have them. It's been great having you on. Thanks so much for joining me on Skeptiko. Thanks so much to Mark for joining me today on Skeptiko. Check out his book, check out his website. There'll be links to that in the show notes. And allow me to tee up one question for this interview. If you'd like to join me on the Skeptiko forum and discuss it, I will be there, and I'll be happy and delighted, actually, if you would join me and other folks and hash out this question. The question I have to pick on is, do you think there has been an evolution of consciousness, and do you think it's tied to Christianity? Is it pivotal on that 2,000-year-ago date as Mark suggests. I think you already know my opinion, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Again, the place to do it is through the Skeptiko forum. As always, be sure to check out the Skeptiko website, where you can find over 400 interviews available for free for download to enjoy and share as you see fit. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Do stick around. I have some good ones coming up. Until next time, take care and bye for now.